Thank you so much. My name again is Paula Castillo. And as Tricia said, I'm a native New Mexican. I'm a local, which kind of means I'm a mestiza with indigenous and European roots whose family has long lived in the rural parts of this particular area of the North American Southwest. I really do have deep and intimate feelings for all New Mexican human geography. As an artist, I create sculptural and performative installations that explore the intersections between the cultural and physical landscapes to reveal the critical interrelationships between humans, the home places we colonize, and the environment. My work could be categorized as allegorical narratives that imagine the immense complexity involved in the deep abiding oneness for all entities, from humans to water, rocks, insects, etc. The all-encompassing goal for my work is to expose our real, dense, and buried attachment to all others. I'd like to thank Tricia Watts for inviting me to speak today. I'm in awe, Tricia, of your tireless effort and singular vision for art's potential to reveal solutions to humans' wildly excessive pride. And I'm so honored to be presenting today with the delightful and hardcore Basha Erland, whose work with Western waters should be required study in all ecology and arts education programming. So I'm gonna share two projects today, and I'll start. I'm gonna do a share screen. Let's see. The first is called Reverse the Curse, and it imagines the river beyond a human resource as a subject deserving of rights. This participatory project captures a democratic rendering of a local curandera-derived remedia to undo a mal de ojo curse on the Rio Grande. It uses kind of what I call the audacity of local magic and traditional healing practices to provide an allegory for an embodied tithing to the Rio Grande River, an entitlement that is not allowed, to a body of water that is not allowed to have any share of the water she carries. The second project I'll talk about briefly is called About Jetty Jack, and it reflects on unjust environmental conditions produced and sustained through engineering practices. I'd like to begin by sharing a little bit of my background with the Rio Grande River. These two pictures seen here are pictures taken by my dad. The one on the left is my mom carrying me, getting into the car before Mass. I was born and raised in a county in the middle of the state of New Mexico, in the southwestern region of the American Southwest. So Valencia County is in the middle of the state. It's considered to be the heart of the middle Rio Grande Valley. I grew up in a little cinder block home that you see here, about 100 feet from the railroad tracks running through Belen. My dad built our family home on this property because it was cheap land, and he believed that being on the west side of the bermed track, you can kind of see it there. I'm riding my bike on the right one, and you can see the train and the bermed track probably popping up from that landscape about 4 feet. So he believed that that berm would protect us from the Rio Grande flooding. And indeed, since the early 20th century, the railroad berm had protected homes many times on this side of the river. When I was a kid growing up in Belen in the 1960s, no one went to the river. Basha hadn't come down yet. The river was like a closed-off fortress, a prisoner of the Middle Rio Grande Conservancy District, which managed and allotted the river. It was already just an irrigation canal. To me, it was like the DMZ zone, heavily managed space. My first experience with the river was as ironic as it gets and occurred when I was a teenager. I got a job across the river from my house at a newly built country club. There was never anything like this anywhere in the history of my rural community, and it has since been abandoned. But in the early 70s, a developer purchased thousands of acres of shrubland at the bottom of the Manzano Mountains, which is at the tail end, the ancient tail end of the Sangre de Cristos. And he sold it off sight unseen in many instances to about 500 new families, most who relocated to our community from the urban regions of the North American East Coast. Replete with a heavily watered golf course, the country club boasted a 50-yard pool where I worked as a lifeguard. This is me just recently at the river, and it reminds me of my first experiences with the river. So for this job, every day I would walk or ride my bike to and from work, crossing the river bridge. And here was my first intimate experience with her. It really was spectral. I'd stop for long periods of time, staring in wonder at every one of her corners as much as possible, meditating on the cottonwood canopy and New Mexico olive and willow understory overgrown with salt cedar, counting the hundreds of Jetty Jacks placed along her banks in the 1960s to keep her meanders straight, listening to the sweet whistles, the echoey whistles of the middle lark, while watching her slow velvet movement over sandbars, feeling the coolness of this riparian environment, entertaining an insect in my mouth. This experience with her, levitating above her, I think changed my life. By the 1970s, the river was no longer flooding like it had in the early to mid 20th century. In 1912, 1920, 1929, 1941, and the last time was 1968. There are hundreds of documented and undocumented stories of the human causation of this early 20th century flooding. But the most tragic and epic is how the building of that train line in front of my childhood home was a major contributor to that flooding. When the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad Company decided that the best way to compete with the opening of the Panama Canal shipping prices was to lay tracks through my hometown of Belen into California, they searched and searched for a source of Douglas fir that could supply all of the ties. They found that source in the forests of the Santa Barbara land grant northeast of Cimayo, New Mexico, in the forest surrounding Jicarita Peak, and the Santa Barbara Tie and Pole Company was born. They bought 300,000 acres of the grant for 25 cents an acre, which not long before had been spuriously separated from the larger Spanish land grant through the strange business of the U.S. Court of Private Land Claims, and of course, which not long before that had been cleaved from the Jicarilla Apache by the Spanish crown, who spuriously assumed their authority over it. For 17 years, until there were no more trees to cut, the lumberjacks voraciously cut down every tree in sight that would make ties. Sawmills were temporarily installed at elevations up to 11,000 feet so the company could produce the ties on site. They even set up track in the denuded forest to carry the ties to the Rio Santa Barbara at Peñasco, where they sat and waited until the spring when the river, swollen with snowmelt, could carry the ties rushing headlong by the hundreds of thousands through the narrow canyons until the river converged with the Rio Grande at Embudo. The transport of ties was made easier, ironically, because of the clear cutting involved. The trees were no longer there to shade and protect the winter snowpack, and now the snowpack melted quickly under the spring sun and bloated the rivers. In 1 degree of separation, the cut trees triggered their own funeral transport on the way to their burial spots, where even in their death they worked, holding up miles and miles of steel railroad track. The forest spilled its guts for those ties, and all that mud and thickness ended up downstream near places like Isleta, Los Lunas, and Belen, where I grew up. The river became clogged with the mountain soil and made the Rio Grande rise, causing thousands of acres of productive fields to become waterlogged and nearly infertile, and unleashed that torrential flooding in the early 20th century. Worse yet, this fallout of human chauvinism and colossal oversight let loose a multitude of forced mechanistic applications on the river to purge it of its supposed natural wastefulness and excessive movements. Over the last 150 years, the Rio Grande has become a colonized migrant. Appallingly, in mid-20th century engineering reports, it is the river who is blamed. She has been called wasteful and superfluous, unnecessary. And now fast forward to the 21st century, the river has surrendered legally every drop of her water to a procession of governing bodies even before it falls as rain or snow from the sky. Shouldn't she be entitled to some of the water she carries? This concern is the harbinger for my project, Reverse the Curse. Imagine that the true original cause of the Rio Grande suffering was a mal de ojo, or evil eye, curse, incited by the American myth of boundless resources. The river, after all, like most victims of the mal de ojo, is a precious life source. It makes sense that the river's natural good fortune provoked the mal de ojo attack by settlers who wanted what she had. Since 2021, I've rallied concerned citizens living along the Rio Grande to come together to perform a curandera-derived remedia and common mal de ojo reversal. As a side note, curanderismo is a liminal practice that leverages both hegemonic structure, European structure like the Catholic Church that the Spanish brought over, while utilizing the deep-rooted healing traditions of native healing practices, communal healing practices. And so their role in a community is to provide remedias to help typically humans heal. And in this case, I think, why not? The river is a sentient being after all. This remedia for me reveals a grassroots desire for participatory guardianship to this vital oasis that has made so many of these communities along the Rio Grande possible. So I invited folks from Taos, New Mexico, down to Juarez, Mexico, to perform this remedia for the Rio Grande at their local river bridge. As well, these events provide as allegory a tithing back to the river, a water entitlement to a body of water that has given everything of herself to our human communities, but not allowed to have any of the water she carries. These performances have been documented with still images. For going with the flow, the show at Site Santa Fe, I took several of these stills and used them as a springboard for inventive cinemagraphs to offer another audience a space to experience a re-performance of this healing ritual, while challenging art conventions by acknowledging the Rio Grande River and its ecological processes as both participant and audience. this is a sculpture called About Jetty Jack, and it's made from steel angle iron and plexiglass with a printed transparent film of an event image from the participatory Reverse the Curse. And it's an approximation of a Kellner jetty, which is a civil engineering construction designed by a civil engineer from Oklahoma. And it was produced and erected throughout the Middle Rio Grande corridor. Thousands of them were placed along the Rio Grande in the mid-20th century to straighten the banks of the river. It was a very successful system for controlling the meander, so it was no surprise when someone got the idea to use jetties to straighten out the entire Middle Rio Grande Valley. This engineering feat produced unintended consequences, though, as we know, like interrupting the river's natural processes, disturbing habitats of species now extirpated or endangered, and promoting exotic species at the expense of native vegetation. When it was done, the river was no longer a natural stream, but a highly modified water storage and conveyance system with extensive flood control structures. And this is the river that I grew up with. So the sculpture that I placed in front of site attempts to juxtapose curanderismo, which is a holistic healing system, with mid-20th century engineering practices, both sort of with the same goals to improve life for humans, to critically examine the impact, though, of mechanical applications on the Rio Grande River's health. As an engineering simulacra, it leverages the Kellner Jack as an enduring record of these mechanical practices and raises questions about the complicated relationship between engineering and environmental justice for the river. Ultimately, my hope with this piece is that it helps us reflect on how unjust environmental conditions are often produced and sustained by short-sighted engineering practices and how that might be made otherwise.